Now, Al-Akhdari is going to, since we're talking about wudu, Al-Akhdari is going to mention some issues of fiqh, which we said is called masail. And what we mean by masail, what we mean by issues of fiqh, are events that take place that are related to fiqh questions. For example, you're always going to find that in fiqh questions we say, if this happens, then you do this. If there was an impurity on your clothing, then you do this. If you missed the prayer, then you do this. This is what we mean by a mas'ala in fiqh. A fiqh issue, we mean a scenario that happens and the rule that applies to it. So here, Al-Akhdari is going to mention the issue of what, the mas'ala, the issue of fiqh, of what a person does when they forget an entire limb during ablution. For example, you make wudu and then you remember that you didn't wash your arms, for example. What are you supposed to do? Or you made ablution, you forgot that you didn't wash your face. Al-Akhdari says here, وَمَنْ نَسِيَ فَرْضًا مِنْ أَعْضَائِهِ, whoever misses an obligatory limb of his wudu, and this goes back to the obligatory limbs that we mentioned in the section where we talked about the obligatory acts of ablution. What is he supposed to do? Al-Akhdari is going to mention that there's either two scenarios in this case. Either you remembered after a long period of time, or you remembered after a short period of time. And as we mentioned before, the difference that we're going to make here is whether or not the limbs are still wet or the limbs are still dry. Because we mentioned the principle earlier that as long as the limbs are still wet, you're considered a person who's in the state of ablution. But if your limbs have dried, then you're not in the state of ablution. So Al-Akhdari says here, فَإِن تَذَكَّرَهُ بِالْقُرْبِ فَعَلَهُ وَمَا بَعْدَهُ وَإِن طَالَ فَعَلَهُ وَحْدَهُ وَعَادَ مَا صَلَّ قَبْلَهُ. Al-Akhdari says here, فَإِن تَذَكَّرَهُ, if you remember بِالْقُرْبِ, if you remember when the time is close. So the question is, what does he mean by close? Close means that the limbs are still wet. So make sure you get that point. The limbs are still wet. What is he supposed to do? فَعَلَهُ وَمَا بَعْدَهُ. Pay attention to the principle here. Al-Akhdari says, if you remember when the time is still close, meaning that your limbs are still wet, you're going to do that action that you missed and then complete everything after it. So for example, I made ablution, I made wudu, and I forgot to wash my face. And then I was walking to my place, wherever I was going to pray, and then I remembered that I didn't wash my face. Because my limbs are still wet, I'm still in the state of wudu. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to wash my face. But Al-Akhdari says, after you finish washing your face, then do all of the other acts of wudu that follow it after. So the person may ask, well, why do I do that? If all I missed was my face, then why am I going to wash my face and then do all of the other actions of wudu after? The reason behind that is because you're still in the state of ablution, you still have the ability to obtain the reward of doing the sunnah. And what's that sunnah? Doing your obligatory acts in order. Because if you were to go back and only wash your face, then that means that your wudu was done without order. So you don't get the sunnah of wudu. So what you're going to do is you're going to go back and wash your face, then you're going to wash your arms, then you're going to wash your head, then you're going to do your feet again, so that you get the reward of doing your sunnah. So that you get the reward of doing your obligatory acts in order, which is sunnah. So that's the meaning of Al-Akhdari when he says, فَإِن تَذَكَّرَهُ, if he remembers the limb that he forgot, بِالْقُرْبِ, after a short period of time, فَعَلَهُ, then he's to go back and wash it, which is obligatory, وَمَا بَعْدَهُ, and to wash everything after that obligatory limb that he left in order to obtain the sunnah. And so know that washing the face in the scenario that we gave is obligatory, but to do everything that's after it is only sunnah in order to get the reward of ablution. To get the reward of doing everything, for doing the obligatory acts in order. Then he mentions the second, وَإِن طَالَ فَعَلَهُ. What if you remembered after a long period of time? وَإِن طَالَ فَعَلَهُ وَحْدَهُ. If a person was to remember after a long time, meaning after the limbs were dry, then there's no way that he can get the reward of doing the sunnah because his limbs are dry. So the only thing that he's going to be requested to do is to go back and finish the limb in which he forgot to wash. Now a person may say, well, if he's not in the state of wudu, in the beginning of the lesson we mentioned that if a person is not in the state of wudu, or if his limbs are already dry, then he has to start his ablution over again. So why here is he allowed to complete his wudu after his limbs have already dried? The difference between this issue of fiqh and the last issue of fiqh is the last issue of fiqh, he didn't do it out of forgetfulness. He did it because he just answered the phone, but he knew that he didn't complete his wudu. For example, he was making wudu, then he went and answered the phone. In this issue, here he forgot to wash a limb. So because a person, according to the Sharia, when a person's in the state of forgetfulness, then he's excused from that act until his memory comes back. So in this issue that we're talking about now, it is permissible for him to go back and just wash the limb that he missed, because the reason why he missed that obligatory act in the first place is because he did it out of forgetfulness. So because he did it out of forgetfulness, he's excused. So that's what he means, وَإِن طَالَ فَعَلَهُ وَحْدَهُ. Then he only does that place that he missed, and that's it. But there's another important part here that Akhdari doesn't mention, that in this second scenario, when a person goes back to complete his wudu after forgetting to wash an obligatory act, and he's going back to complete it after his limbs have already dried, he must make the niyyah that he's completing his wudu. Because the fact that he's not in the state of wudu, he has to make a new niyyah. In the scenario that we mentioned before this, when a person remembered when his limbs were still wet, he's still in the state of ablution, so he doesn't need to make a new wudu. He doesn't have to make a new niyyah. But in this issue, because his limbs are already dry and he's going back to complete a wudu after leaving the state of wudu, he must make a new niyyah here, a new intention, that I'm doing this to complete the wudu in which I forgot to wash one of my limbs. So the niyyah here is important. So, and then Al-Akhdari says, وَعَادَ مَا صَلَّى قَبْلَهُ. In both scenarios that we mentioned, whether a person remembers after a long period of time or a short period of time, if he prayed with that wudu that wasn't complete, then he must repeat that prayer. So for example, I prayed, but I didn't wash my face because I did it out of forgetfulness. So I prayed, and then after I prayed, I remembered that I didn't wash my face during ablution. Then that prayer has to be repeated. So what we mentioned here is in regards to a person who missed or forgot to wash a complete limb during his ablution. Al-Akhdari then mentions, وَإِن تَرَكَ سُنَّةً فَعَلَهَا وَلَا يُعِيدُ الصَّلَاةِ. If a person were to remember, if the scenario that we mentioned was related to a person who missed the sunnah. So for example, we mentioned first that a person who missed an obligatory limb, but now we're talking about a person who missed the sunnah. For example, returning the wiping of the head, or doing istinshaq, blowing water into the nose, or blowing water out of the nose, or inhaling, or washing the hands at the beginning of prayer. Then he just does it. So for example, if he forgot to do it, then he should just go do it, and he doesn't have to repeat his prayer. So for example, a person who misses washing his mouth, then he's just going to go back and wash his mouth, and he doesn't have to wash anything after that. And if he were to pray without doing a sunnah, then his prayer is still sound, and it's not permissible for a person to repeat it. So that's the difference between missing a limb. It's obligatory for you to, an obligatory limb. Then if you pray without completing your wudu, then it's obligatory to make up your prayer. Here, if you miss a sunnah, then there's no repeating your prayer. Matter of fact, it's not permissible to repeat your prayer. And then the last issue and then another issue he's going to mention is a person who missed a spot on one of the obligatory limbs. For example, in the past example, we were talking about you didn't wash your arms at all. You didn't wash your face at all. You didn't wash your feet at all. Now we're talking about you missed washing a spot. For example, let's say you had dough or some type of covering on your hand or on your arms, and you forgot to wash it. You forgot to remove the dough for some reason, and you missed washing that part of the arm, or for whatever reason you missed washing a spot on one of the obligatory acts. This is what Al-Akhdari is going to mention now. وَمَنْ نَسِيَ لُمْعَةً غَسَلَهَا وَحْدَهَا بِنِيَّةٍ. If a person missed washing a spot on one of his limbs, غَسَلَهَا, then it's obligatory for him to wash it وَحْدَهَا بِنِيَّةٍ, with an intention. Here it's obligatory for the person just to go back and wash that spot that he missed, and he must have a niyyah. He must have intention. And what is his intention here? His intention is that I'm washing this spot in order to complete my wudu. And the reason why the niyyah is important here is because if a person just washes, how do we distinguish between whether a person is doing that washing for the sake of niyyah, for the sake of worship, or just for the sake of doing a customary washing? Niyyah, what's the importance of niyyah in the Sharia? It separates worship from custom, from acts of custom. That's the whole point of having a niyyah. So when you're going back to complete that spot that you missed, you have to have the niyyah here that you're completing your ablution. And just like the first issue that we mentioned, that if a person prayed after missing a complete obligatory limb, then if he prayed, then he must repeat his prayer. The same thing here, because the fact that you missed a spot on an obligatory limb, then it means that you didn't have wudu, so you have to repeat your prayer. That's why it says وَإِن صَلَّ قَبْلَ ذَلِكَ عَادَ. And if he prays before that, and if he prayed before, what does it mean? قَبْلَ ذَلِكَ, before that. If he prayed before completing his wudu properly, then he must repeat his prayer. Then the next issue that Al-Akhdari is going to explain here is, although he's giving it to you in the style of an issue of fiqh, here he's actually telling you, he's actually indirectly giving you a principle of fiqh. What's the principle of fiqh? The principle of fiqh is that we do not return from a sunnah. We do not return from an obligatory act back to a sunnah act. Make sure you understand this point well, because it's going to come again when it's one of the main principles of when we do the chapter of making prostration for forgetfulness. So the rule is that we do not, after we start doing an obligatory act, we do not return back to a sunnah. So for example, Al-Akhdari is going to mention here, وَمَنْ تَذَكَّرَ الْمَضْمَضَةَ وَالْإِسْتِنْشَاقَ بَعْدَ أَنْ شَرَعَ فِي الْوَجْهِ. A person who remembered that he didn't wash his mouth or make istinshaq, meaning he didn't put water in his nose, meaning that he didn't do one of the three sunnahs at the beginning of the prayer. At the beginning of his ablution. That's why it says ba'da an shara'a fil wajhi. So he remembered that he didn't wash his mouth nor his nose. But when did he remember? After he already started washing his face, meaning that he already did He already started doing his first obligatory act in ablution. What is he supposed to do? Al-Akhdari says, فَلَا يَرْجِعُ إِلَيْهِمَا. He does not return to these two things, meaning he doesn't return to washing the mouth or washing the nose, حَتَّى يُتِمَّ wudu'ahu, until he completes his wudu. What does it mean by until he completes his wudu? Until he completes the obligatory acts of wudu, because the principle is that we do not return. We do not leave an obligatory act to return back to a sunnah.